Today, 10th July, we are now well into the second month of Ukraine's offensive, and there are continuing rumours of disenchantment and concern within Ukraine about the progress of this offensive, including an interesting report from a Ukrainian Telegram channel. I'm sorry to say I'm not sure which one. I read this report on the blog of Simplicius the Thinker. Anyway, a report which suggested that General Zaluzhny has reported to President Zelensky that in effect, that the 200-day time window for the offensive that I was discussing in my program yesterday, and which supposedly originated from Zelensky's office, and which was reported by the legitimate Telegram channel, that might be over-optimistic. Apparently, General Zaluzhny, according to this report, informed President Zelensky that Ukraine is losing not just large numbers of men, but large amounts of heavy equipment every day, between 6 and 11 armored vehicles a day, that at this rate of loss, it will not be possible to sustain the offensive beyond the summer months, by which I take Zaluzhny to mean the end of August, and at that point, Ukraine will have to revert to the defensive, and Zaluzhny apparently also, according to this report, told President Zelensky that given the rate of loss, it would be much better if Ukraine reverted to a defensive strategy, called off the offensive, and in particular called off the attacks on Bakhmut, which it has been increasingly focusing on over the course of the last couple of days. I'll come to the fighting in Bakhmut in a moment. Anyway, that is what this report says. It must be said that we've had lots of reports about arguments and disputes between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky in the past. It's never been possible to confirm any of these, but we did have that very strange disappearance of General Zaluzhny that went on for weeks and weeks, and which started in the spring. I speculated at the time that General Zaluzhny was unhappy about the entire idea of sending his forces on the offensive, and it did look as if he had been sidelined, and as if General Syrski, the ground forces commander, had in effect assumed control. And there were even suggestions that General Zaluzhny had fallen out of favour and might be under house arrest. Well, that seems unlikely, but he did resurface a couple of days ago. He spoke to General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he gave that interview to the Washington Post, which I discussed some days ago, in which he straightforwardly said that the entire offensive, as planned, was misconceived, that a situation in which the Russians have overwhelming artillery superiority and control of the air makes an offensive doctrinally impossible, according to NATO's own doctrines and according to Russia's doctrines. And Zaluzhny seemed to be demanding more weapons from the West in order to continue with the offensive. F-16 fighter jets, obviously, but also artillery, more artillery rounds, more 155mm artillery rounds to at least balance, if not fully, then at least to some extent, the overwhelming superiority which the Russians possessed in artillery. And we've seen over the last couple of days the astonishing admission, the astonishing confirmation from the United States that all those reports by Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, by this channel, by us, Alex Christoforou and myself at the Duran, by various other independent analysts, Scott Ritter, for example, and others, that the ability of the West, of the United States, to continue to supply Ukraine with artillery was finite, and that we were rapidly reaching the end point when that could be done. And we had the announcement a couple of days ago that instead of sending conventional artillery rounds, the United States is instead going to send old cluster munitions, and Ukraine will just have to make do with those, despite the enormous ethical concerns and the fact that these are hardly adequate substitutes for the kinds of shells and that Ukraine needs. And it would make complete sense, therefore, for this report about Zaluzhny's advice to Zelensky to call the offensive off, to withdraw into defensive positions. It would make complete sense if that were true, because whatever is the case with the F-16s, and it's important to say that as at this moment in time, no Ukrainian pilots have been trained to fly F-16s, and no final decision to supply F-16s has as yet been publicly made. Perhaps one exists, perhaps it's only a question of time, quite possibly, probably even, it will happen in Vilnius. But anyway, for the moment, no such announcement has been publicly made, and the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, is that once it is made, and once those F-16s are delivered, which could be months into the future, then it will not make any significant difference on the battlefields. In fact, on that topic, literally just before I was making this program, I started making this program, I saw a report on the Slavyangrad Telegram site that that Rostec, the umbrella company that brings together the Russian military-industrial complex, that they have confirmed that production of Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 34 jets, the mainstays of the Russian Air Force, along with the advanced versions of the Sukhoi 30, and the aircraft mainly operated by Russia in Ukraine, and aircraft that are, by universal consent, far superior to the F-16s, that production of these aircraft has doubled, and that the Defense Ministry is receiving increasing numbers, the Russian Defense Ministry is receiving increasing numbers of these powerful aircraft. So anyway, given that this is so, given what has been disclosed about the artillery crisis, it makes perfect sense for General Zaluzhny to give the advice he is supposed to have given to President Zelensky. There's no point in dragging this offensive out for 100 or 200 days, depleting whatever remains of the ammunition stockpile even further, relying on cluster munitions which are problematic and which might cause Ukraine potential political embarrassment, and which probably won't achieve the necessary effects on the battlefield. Rather than do that, better to conserve forces to prevent further losses of tanks and armoured vehicles. And the United States, for the moment, is replacing, apparently 1-for-1, American armoured vehicles that get destroyed, Bradleys and Strykers, but it is not replacing the Soviet-era infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, which were Ukraine's mainstay before these Western vehicles were supplied, so that the overall stock of armoured vehicles that Ukraine possesses is depleting. And the same, by the way, is true in tanks, even if more Western tanks are going to be supplied over the next few weeks. But note that these will be primarily old tanks like the Leopard 1, unsuitable for use on Ukrainian battlefields. But anyway, it makes complete sense for Zaluzhny to say, call it off, preserve to the greatest extent possible that which we already have. Go on to the defensive. Give up this offensive. We are not going to break through. It's absolutely clear that that's not going to happen. All we are achieving is that we are losing men and machines faster than we can replace them. The West's promises have fallen short, and in the meantime, even as we grow weaker, the Russians get stronger. Now, that also corresponds to a great extent with what we're hearing about the situation on the battlefronts. And I haven't perhaps talked about the situation on the battlefronts very much over the last couple of days, but I will now undertake a brief summary. And the first thing to say is that this change of tactics that the Ukrainians are engaging in, the attacks with small groups of light infantry trying to attack the Russian lines, getting hammered by Russian artillery and heavy machine guns, taking horrific losses and being thrown back by Russian counterattacks. That's now the change in this tactics has now been commented upon officially by the Russians themselves. There's been this commentary by Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the regional government in Donetsk city, in Donetsk region. He actually now has come forward and has actually said that this is indeed the change in strategy that Ukraine is now following, that they're no longer attacking with large amounts of armor, that they're launching these light infantry attacks instead. And this is what Denis Pushilin is reported to have said on Monday. He, in an interview, a live broadcast with Rossiya 24 television, in other words, on Russian television. The enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, no longer throw such large forces into battle, as was the case at the beginning of the counteroffensive, and tries to use small groups. But our units are ready for that and cope with their objectives quite successfully. So already the Ukrainians are trying to conserve what armor they have left by engaging the Russians in these attacks. There's even been a rather, I have to say it, cold-blooded, or cynical if you prefer, assessment which has been going the rounds, which originates supposedly from a NATO official. This says that the Ukrainians are insensitive to human losses. So rather than try to launch big armored push thrusts against Russian positions, they send repeated groups, let's call them waves, though I'm distrustful of that word, as you know, waves of light infantry attacks against particular Russian positions. The Ukrainians take very heavy losses as a result, but the fact that they're able to undertake these repeated attacks on Russian positions supposedly means that sooner or later the Russians, who by contrast are said to be more casualty averse, eventually retreat, and that enables the Ukrainians to capture these positions and to occupy them themselves. So in that way, progress at the cost of enormous numbers of lives is supposedly achieved. And it may be true that this tactic has achieved those results in a number of places. But I have to say that the latest reports suggest that, in fact, what is actually happening is that though these attacks might have gained Russian trenches, captured Russian trenches, the Ukrainians are never able to hold them for very long. That all that happens is that cascades of artillery fire from the Russian side then get concentrated on the trenches, that the Ukrainians eventually are pushed back. And whilst the trenches are said to be unusable because of the enormous amount of damage and the dead bodies and all of these things, well, it's not clear that the Ukrainians are making any significant gains. In fact, if one looks at the whole situation overall, the impression I've got, and it is only an impression because I don't have that granular knowledge of the battlefronts, which I suspect only the commands of the two sides actually possess. But the impression I'm getting is that it is in fact the Russians who over the last couple of days have actually gained more ground than they have lost. There was a report, in fact this is more than a report, it seems to be largely confirmed, that the Ukrainians have pulled back all of their troops from the Piatikhatki area. This is this village near the Dnieper River, which the Ukrainians were making a big effort to try to capture, possibly in anticipation of an amphibious assault across the Dnieper River from the Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper onto the Russian-controlled east bank. Anyway, the Ukrainians seem to have pulled back their forces. Perhaps the failure of the amphibious assault on the Antonovsky Bridge has decided them that an amphibious assault is not going to take place and that they might as well therefore call off the whole Piatikhatki attack because it's lost its logic. But anyway, they do seem to have pulled back after suffering very heavy losses in that particular area. And there's been some suggestions that they are actually now losing ground on the Vremevka ledge. Now, I have to stress this is impression rather than reporting, but there have been some suggestions that the Ukrainians have been coming under heavy pressure in the Vremevka ledge, and that it could be that the Russians are gaining ground there. I don't want to say more about this because I'm not sure that this is actually factually true, but anyway, it is my impression. And there's also been some speculation, which I've touched on in the past, but which others are now repeating, that with the area around the former Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, being the only area where the Russians have not had the time to build the elaborate fortified lines that they built everywhere else on the battlefronts, troops have been reassigned from the Zaporozhye and Kherson fronts to the Bakhmut area, where Ukraine has been trying, unsuccessfully as it happens, to launch attacks. And I'm going to anticipate what I'm going to say about the Bakhmut situation shortly by saying that my sense is that even there, and despite this heavy reinforcement by Ukraine, it is the Russians again who over the last 2 days or so may have gained more ground. But perhaps the most important area where it seems by general acknowledgement the Russians are advancing is at the far north of the front line. They're pushing forward apparently near Kremenaya, Saratovo. There have been Ukrainian attacks near Liman, but these have been repelled and the Russians continue to advance there. And the Russians seem to be working hard to gradually invest Kupiansk before perhaps launching an assault on the town, and on Siversk as well, where they seem to be in the process of recapturing the hotly contested village of Spornoye, which is widely seen as an important village to control in this part of northern Donbass, and which is important for the recapture both of Liman, and perhaps ultimately the capture of Siversk. It's Siversk as well, this other important town which the Russians failed to capture in the summer of last year, a fact which seems to have left their defences in northern Donbass and in southern Kharkiv region to some extent unanchored, exposing them to the Ukrainian counterattack that took place in Kharkiv region last year. But anyway, so overall the picture is of the Russians gaining ground. Maybe this tactic of sending light infantry, accepting huge losses, and some of the pictures I'm seeing, by the way, are harrowing, but accepting huge losses in order to capture these trenches doesn't seem to be working, because the Russians are able to counterattack and recapture these trenches. And maybe the trenches are initially unusable, but the Russians have large amounts of mechanized trench building equipment, and quite possibly they're able to lay fresh trenches where the old trenches were, and plant more minefields, and do all of these things. It's important to say that even if this tactic does achieve results in the way that that NATO officer implied, it would mean that every meter of ground that Ukraine is capturing is paid for in an enormous cost in Ukrainian lives. And moreover, the level of progress is extremely small, because it means that you have to attack one fortified line after another in this way, with repeated waves of infantry. You're losing men, even if you can capture a trench, and even if you can hold it against the Russian artillery fire and the Russian counterattacks, expending more lives in doing so. You're only advancing one trench or hamlet at a time at enormous cost in lives. And it's difficult to see how such an offensive can be sustained for very long. And overall, if you look at the map of the battle lines, it has hardly changed since the offensive began at the start of June, on the 4th of June. Ukraine has made no significant progress, despite 6 weeks now of extremely heavy fighting. And if they're actually being pushed back in a number of places, well, it's even worse for them. And let me repeat a point I've made in many programs now. Every one of these attacks, every single attack that we have seen, has invariably happened in the former grey zone. In no place have the Ukrainians actually reached the big Russian fortifications, the so-called Surovikin line, which is some way to the south of where the fighting is currently taking place in Zaporozhye and Kherson region and southern Donetsk, and east of the former Bakhmut, between Bakhmut, Artyomovsk as it is today, and Popasnaya, and of course well to the east of the areas where the Russians are now advancing in northern Donbass and in southern Kharkiv region, in the areas of Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman, Seversk, and Kupiansk. So this tactic, which may have been forced on the Ukrainians through heavy equipment losses, it doesn't seem to me that it is viable in the long term, and in fact all it is doing is piling up corpses to no real military purpose, at least that I can see. So I think I would say that. Now, is it even true, however, that Ukraine is successfully conserving its armoured vehicle fleet? Well, it's not losing armoured vehicles on anything like the scale that it did in the first 2 weeks of the offensive back in June. But it's important to remember that the scale at which Ukraine was losing armoured vehicles, Leopard 2s, Bradleys, and other vehicles in those first 2 weeks was absolutely catastrophic. It was obvious that Ukraine could not sustain an offensive with those sort of losses. So inevitably, Ukraine has had to pull its armour back. But that doesn't mean that it isn't continuing to lose armour. And I'm afraid that there are now multiplying photographs and video films showing Russian drones, Russian aircraft, Russian long-range artillery systematically destroying Ukrainian armoured formations behind the front lines. In fact, there's been pictures which show all sorts of advanced weapon systems, Leopard 2 tanks, Caesar self-propelled howitzers, M109 howitzers, other such valuable and rare machines, as well as Bradleys and the rest, being destroyed by Lancet drones, artillery, Russian artillery strikes, sometimes using precision-guided Krasnopol drones, rounds and things of that kind. And it's clear that the Russians have saturated the skies behind the front lines with their drones, that Ukraine has no effective counter to these drones. Its air defense system on the front lines appears to have largely broken down, so that the Russians are able to operate with drone fleets over Ukrainian positions essentially at will. And they're now apparently again using helicopters to hunt down armoured vehicles behind the Ukrainian front lines. And they are succeeding in doing so. After all, Zaluzhny supposedly reported as much to Zelensky. So it looks as if Zaluzhny, if this report is correct, but I suspect it does reflect his actual views, is right. What Ukraine needs to do is to call the offensive off and pull back. And the one area where Ukraine might have expected to make a real breakthrough, in the area of the former Bakhmut, where Russian defenses were much weaker. The Russians had only just captured Bakhmut. They only captured Bakhmut on the 20th of May. They've not had the time to fully consolidate their control of the town and the surrounding countryside and villages. Even there, things are not going well. There have been repeated Ukrainian attacks to capture places like the villages of Klesheyevka and Kurdyumovka and Belgova, a little bit to the north. All of these have apparently been repelled. There have been Russian counterattacks, which have succeeded in pushing the Ukrainians back. The Russians undoubtedly are taking losses here in this particular area, but Ukrainian losses, by all accounts, all the realistic accounts, are much greater, perhaps 4 times greater. And it looks as if the situation in the Bakhmut area is going to become even more difficult for Ukraine than it has been up to now, because yesterday, Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, the head of the Chechen regional government, as I've been corrected, and that's perhaps what I should call him, but the head of Chechnya's regional government has confirmed that the Akhmat Special Forces units, at least 2 brigades of them, perhaps 10,000 men in total, I suspect the forces that were reassigned to Rostov in a hurry to deal with Prigozhin and his mutineers, that these are now all being deployed in Bakhmut. The Russian forces that are defending this area say that there are 67,000 Ukrainian troops in the vicinity of the former Bakhmut that have been carrying out these attacks. There's said to be around 50,000 Russian troops defending Artyomovsk and various positions around it. So the Ukrainians do have a superiority in manpower, though not an overwhelming one. And this is, of course, offset by Russian superiority in artillery, tanks, and, of course, the Russian Air Force has been busy in this area as well. But if these 10,000 Chechen troops arrive, then it seems to me that this Ukrainian superiority in manpower, which, as I said, is not overwhelming, will end. And it's difficult to see how, in that case, Ukraine would be able to recapture Bakhmut. So, in no part so far has Ukraine achieved any significant breakthroughs, and in no place does there seem to be any prospect of those breakthroughs. Now, in the absence of breakthroughs, we have seen other attacks. We had all those threats of attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Ukrainians were saying that the Russians were going to blow it up. The Russians were saying that the Ukrainians were going to attack it. I've already made it very clear that I could see no rationale for the Russians wanting to blow up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The IAEA has said that there's no evidence that the Russians had any such plans. Anyway, that idea, if it existed in Ukraine, and I'm not entirely certain that it did, of trying to attack, launch some kind of incident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, that seems to have been called off. I discussed yesterday the missile attack on the Kerch Bridge, and I speculated that it had been carried out with British Storm Shadow missiles. Well, we now have had a detailed explanation, account of the attack from the Russian side, and it was not Storm Shadows. Ukraine converted old Soviet-era S-200 surface-to-air missiles. This was the surface-to-air missile that the Soviet Union began operating in the 1960s, and which is the predecessor to the S-300. Russia no longer operates these missiles, but Ukraine still has a few. Anyway, Ukraine converted some of these missiles, or has converted some of these missiles, to an ground role, to a land attack role, and it launched 4 of these missiles towards the Kerch Bridge and towards Rostov region, which is further to the east. 2 missiles against the Kerch Bridge, 2 missiles against Rostov region. And all of these missiles, all of these S-200 missiles were shot down by Russia's air defenses. It seems that in the case of the attack on the Kerch Bridge, the missiles, the surface-to-air missiles, the Russian surface-to-air missiles that shot down these converted S-200s were S-400 missiles, the far more sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, which are now in the Russians' possession. Before I leave this topic, just to say that, of course, as I discussed in the past, Ukraine has previously endlessly claimed that the Russians have used S-300 missiles in a land attack role. I've said that I thought that was extremely unlikely and that there was no evidence of it, and that almost certainly the Ukrainians were saying this to explain away the fact that the S-300s that they have, their mainstay of their air defenses, that these S-300s sometimes fall to earth and cause damage on Ukrainian buildings. And rather than admit to that fact, and to the fact that these S-300s were missing their targets, that the Ukrainians were pretending that these were Russian missiles used in a land attack role. So that was what the Ukrainians were claiming. They're saying much less of that at the moment, by the way, now that it seems their stock of S-300s has been largely exhausted and that they're now dependent increasingly on Western missiles, surface-to-air missiles, which cannot be passed off as Russian missiles. But anyway, the Ukrainians, having claimed that the Russians had adapted old S-300 missiles to a land attack role, something for which, as I said, there was no evidence, have in fact been demonstrated as using converted S-200 surface-to-air missiles in a land attack role, even though the attack was unsuccessful. So that was another operation which failed. And there are, therefore, so far as I can see, increasingly few cards left for Ukraine to play. I can't, obviously, exclude the possibility that they might come up with something, but for the moment, I can't really see myself what that something can be. Now, there are increasing numbers of people in the West who are extremely troubled about this, who are to some extent in denial about this, but who are nonetheless obliged to accept, to acknowledge that the expectations about the successful Ukrainian offensive have not been fulfilled. So General Ben Hodges, who was predicting that Ukraine would recapture Crimea by August, has now sort of accepted that that isn't going to happen. And he is saying that the reason that hasn't happened is because the West didn't supply enough weapons to Ukraine. It didn't supply fighter jets and ATACMS missiles and those kind of things, and that is the reason why the offensive has not achieved the results that he was expecting. And there's been a similar article in Der Spiegel in Germany. It too says that Ukraine's offensive is faltering, it's not achieving the results that had been expected of it. It too blames the West, notably Germany itself, for the failure to supply Ukraine with all the weapons that Ukraine needed in order to conduct a successful offensive. And it says that the West at the Vilnius summit now needs to recommit to supplying, finally, Ukraine with the weapons that it needs in order to win the war. But perhaps the most disturbing article of this kind is from Simon Tisdall in The Guardian. And I've discussed many times Simon Tisdall's various pieces, the way in which he seems almost to ache for a war between the West and Russia. And he's back at it again in his latest piece, which I'm not going to read. I find reading his pieces disturbing enough. This article, however, has gained a lot of attention, though it is all of a piece with all of the others that he has written, but it comes with the important admission that the Ukrainian offensive is not succeeding. And he speaks about a stalemate developing on the battlefronts. Larry Johnson has already discussed how there is no stalemate actually developing on the battlefronts in Ukraine. What is actually happening is that the Ukrainian military is being hammered to pieces by the Russians. Once that process is concluded, Ukraine will be shattered and the Russians will be in a position finally to win the war and to dictate terms. But anyway, I don't want to repeat that again. No Western commentator who supports Ukraine up to this point is prepared to come out and straightforwardly say that Ukraine is going to lose. So they all instead hide behind the euphemism that instead of it achieving victory, it will be pushed into a stalemate position, which they nonetheless acknowledge would be tantamount to a sort of defeat. Anyway, Simon Tisdall talks about this. He says that the Ukrainian offensive is not achieving breakthroughs, that he sort of acknowledges, he doesn't quite acknowledge, but he sort of acknowledges that this breakthrough from the offensive that he's been hoping for and others have been hoping for will not be achieved. And he worries that there will be a stalemate, and he worries that once that stalemate is achieved, Western support for Ukraine will decline, that there will be less support for Ukraine than there has been up to now. And Tisdall, once again, comes up with demands which essentially amount to direct Western intervention in the conflict in order supposedly to redress the balance. He once again dismisses any real risk of a direct confrontation with Russia. He suggests that Ukraine be granted NATO membership, or at least that 85% of Ukraine be granted NATO membership. He essentially says that NATO would in effect guarantee that remaining 85% of Ukrainian territory from Russian attack, and that would be sufficient to deter the Russians from attacking that part of Ukraine. He makes an astonishing and blatantly false analogy with West Germany. He says that even though large areas of German territory were occupied by the Russians during the Cold War, he is of course referring to the former East Germany. Nonetheless, in 1955, the rest of Germany, he is of course referring to West Germany, that West Germany was able to join NATO in 1955. The fact that this is a completely false analogy is immediately obvious. In 1955, there was no fighting taking place between West and East Germany, or between West Germany and Russia for that matter. There had been no fighting between any Russian troops and any German troops since the 9th of May, 1945. There had, in other words, been a full decade of peace, and no one in 1955 assumed that that peace would change simply because West Germany at that time was joining NATO, though it should be said that that was seen as a deeply provocative act at the time, not just in the Soviet Union, but even by some people in the West. Well, however, having said that, the situation today is completely different. Unlike 1955 Germany, today's Ukraine is most definitely in war. There is fighting going on. There are missile strikes in every part of Ukrainian territory. What Tisdall is assuming is that simply announcing that Ukraine is part of NATO will somehow stop that war in its tracks, or at least will prevent it extending further westward from the places where it is now. Now, that is an utterly reckless and irresponsible assumption. It is an assumption which the Russians would emphatically refute. And I'm glad to say that I get the strong sense that no Western government thinks the way that Simon Tisdall does. But we can see how some people in the West, confronted with the situation of an offensive that isn't working, they are not prepared to pull back. They want to see further escalation. And they're also, of course, in denial about the fundamental problem. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed at length the question of the cluster munitions, the fact that the ammunition stocks in the West have become exhausted, the fact that the supply of the cluster munitions, as the United States has itself admitted, is because supply of 155mm shells has become exhausted. And given that this is an artillery war, that is critical for Ukraine. People like Tisdall, they don't really explain how the West is going to guarantee Ukraine if its own armies now are without artillery ammunition, as appears to be largely the case. It would presumably be some kind of air campaign. It would mean hurling Western air forces over great distances against the most sophisticated air defense system on the planet, which is Russia's. It would be an absolute horrific disaster. It would be a monstrous bluff, which I cannot imagine any Western official would want to see through, and which the Russians would be certain to call. So anyway, there we go. That's Western officials. Some Western commentators, they want the war to continue, notwithstanding everything. And that is why General Zaluzhny's advice is going to be ignored, as all his advice has consistently been. There are lots of reports, almost certainly true reports, that back in the summer of last year, he was skeptical about the ideas of launching offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region. Even then, he thought that Ukraine should go onto the defensive. And it's quite clear, at least to me, that he did not want Ukraine to go onto the offensive this summer either. And he had even better cause to doubt the wisdom of that offensive, and in that he has been proved absolutely right. And yet we see how this alliance of hardliners in Kiev and hardliners in the Brussels bureaucracy, amongst the neocons in Washington, amongst the hardliners in London and Berlin, continues just not only to prolong this war, but to push Ukraine into offensives, which it is disastrous for Ukraine to undertake. Well, this offensive will run its course before long. I guesstimated 100 days, which would have brought us to the end of August. Zelensky's officials apparently think that it might be 200 days from basically where we are now, which would take us through perhaps to the end of this year. Zaluzhny thinks it's more likely to be the end of August, which is roughly the point where I thought it would probably come to an end. And that now brings us to what the Russians are going to do. And today we had a bombshell report, and it came from TASS. It was already partly floated, I believe, in the British media. It's interesting to know how they got the information. But anyway, TASS is reporting today that President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has confirmed that Putin, after the defeat of the Prigozhin coup, had a meeting with Prigozhin himself in the Kremlin and with the higher commanders of the Wagner organization. And this is what the TASS report says. Russian President Vladimir Putin had a nearly 3-hour-long meeting with Yevgeny Prigozhin and PMC Wagner commanding officers in the Kremlin on June 29th, Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov said on Monday. Commenting on a piece by the Libération newspaper, Libération is a French newspaper, so it was not the British media, it was the French media, about Putin's meeting with Prigozhin after what happened on June 24th, the Kremlin spokesman said the president did hold such a meeting. He invited 35 people, all the squad commanders and the leadership of the private military company, including Prigozhin. The meeting took place in the Kremlin on June 29th and lasted for nearly 3 hours. We are unaware of the details of the meeting, but the one thing we can say is that the president gave his assessment of the private military company's actions on the front line during the special military operation and the June 24th events. In other words, Putin made clear to these officers and to Prigozhin himself that he is aware of and values Wagner's contribution in the battles of Popasnaya, Lysychansk, Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, in Soledar and in Bakhmut, but he also made clear to them what he thought about the coup attempt that Prigozhin attempted to launch on the 24th of June. And then it goes on to say, Peskov went on to say, Putin listened to explanations from Wagner's commanders and offered them further options for employment and further use in combat. In other words, he made it clear again to them that they had to sign contracts with the Russian military. And then Peskov goes on to say the commanders themselves shared their version of what happened on 24th June. They emphasize that they are staunch supporters and soldiers of the head of state and the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, and also that they are ready to continue fighting for the fatherland. In other words, they reaffirmed in person their loyalty, even fealty, if you like, to Putin himself and to Russia. And they repeated once again that they are prepared to enter the battle, they're prepared to fight on Russia's behalf wherever he sends them. Now, it's not at all clear what this meeting has led to. There's been reports. There was a really interesting interview given by Lukashenko a couple of days ago, in which he said that Prigozhin has not remained in Belarus and that there's been no mass transfer of Wagner fighters to Belarus. It seems Wagner troops are still in their original camps in the Donbass. I get the sense that something is being hammered out and that some kind of agreement is in the works about how Wagner is going to be used and about Prigozhin's own role, which I suspect is going to be reduced significantly. There's been a further email to me from my source about the Wagner organization. This person tells me that his contacts within Wagner speak of extremely heavy pressure from the Russian security services on individual members of the Wagner organization. And in support of that, there are now further reports that Prigozhin himself continues to be under criminal investigation, possibly this time on fraud charges. He's not yet agreed to go to Belarus, and the Russian authorities are therefore keeping the threat of a criminal prosecution alive by continuing some kind of threat of prosecution. But it looks like the Wagner troops do not want to leave Russia. They do not want to be reallocated or reassigned to other roles. They went out of their way to reassure Putin of their personal loyalty and of the fact that they have no demands to make against him. They seem to have asked again for them to be given permission to continue operating without a contract, without some kind of signed agreements with the Ministry of Defense. But Putin himself, well, what we hear is that he offered them options for employment and further use in combat, and we don't quite know exactly what that all means. So it's all looks like it's in the air, but it is intriguing. It seems as if they have told Putin that they want to regain, if you like, their reputation by being allowed once more to fight on the battlefields. And by the way, there was an interview between one important Wagner commander who goes by the name of Lotos. He gave an interview in which he essentially, as far as I can see, said much of what you might glean from this report, that the Wagner fighters are still unwilling to subordinate themselves to the Ministry of Defense, despite Putin's and the Ministry of Defense's insistence. But they still want to participate in the war. They don't want to be reassigned to Belarus. They don't want to be sent off to Africa. They want to find some way back in. And we'll see whether or not some sort of a compromise can be reached between them and the Russian authorities. One thing is absolutely clear, however, and that is that the leadership of the Ministry of Defense is not going to be changed. General Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has been busy inspecting the front lines. He's been seen again doing so. There were reports in the British media yesterday that General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, had been sacked and was going to be replaced by General Teplinsky, the head of Russia's airborne forces. I've spoken about him in the past. He is a highly rated and very popular commander in Russia. His outstanding leadership in the defense of Kherson made caused him to achieve great credit during the fighting last year. And anyway, it's understandable perhaps why there are rumors that he has replaced Gerasimov. But obviously, in response to that, the Russian Ministry of Defense has now published a video in which Gerasimov is seen receiving a report from the Chief of Staff of Russia's air defense, who's providing Gerasimov with an update of the attack on the Kerch Bridge and on Rostov with these S-200 missiles, converted S-200 missiles, which Ukraine launched and which I discussed previously. And it's absolutely clear from this video that Gerasimov remains in charge and in control. And this video was clearly intended to refute that British story. So there we go. We will see what happens with the Wagner organization. Apparently these troops are desperate to be rehabilitated in some way and to rejoin the battle when they're fully re-equipped and retrained and are ready to do so in August. We'll see what deal is eventually reached with them, if such a deal is possible. But it's clear that they solicited the meeting with Putin, and it's also clear that Putin was prepared to meet with them and listen to their protestations of loyalty, and perhaps some sort of way will be found to work this thing through. About Prigozhin himself, however, I strongly expect that his role in the war is now largely ended, and I would not be surprised myself if we saw a more public face from a military commander taking control of Wagner in future, and we'll see exactly how this particular unit is more closely integrated into the Russian Defense Ministry's command structures. Anyway, that's where we are. It looks as if the offensive, as I said, has now fully ground to a halt. Things are not looking good on any part of the battlefronts, and it looks as if Wagner may be back. Anyway, more about all of these things, all of these topics in future programs. In the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all of our programs on our various channels on BitChute, Rockfit, Locals, Rumble, and Telegram, and ODYSEE, and that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video that you can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.